All right, so we will get started. Welcome everyone to our weekly webinar. My name is Amy Clausen. If you haven't seen me here every week, I'm the Director of Finance and Marketing here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum. So today I'll be monitoring the Q&A box and the chat box at the bottom of the screen there. So if you have any questions or comments for Shawna today, feel free to put them in the box and we can do them at the end, or if there's a more appropriate time, I can bring them up through her talk as well. So as I mentioned, today our presenter is the museum's assistant curator, Shawna Butts. Shawna's been with the museum here since 2017. She received her honors BA in anthropology from the University of Guelph, which I did as well. And she went on to complete her advanced diploma in applied museum studies at Algonquin College. She's worked at several institutions over the past 10 years, including the Canadian Fossil Discovery Centre, the Royal Tyrrell Museum, the Senate of Canada, and in community museums in the Hamilton and Burlington area. As the assistant curator and educational programmer here, Shawna helps manage the collection, perform curatorial duties, and assist with the planning and administration of public programs and exhibitions. So today, Shawna is going to talk about some of Niagara-on-the-Lake's important women, and I will turn it over to Shawna.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for everyone for joining me this afternoon. While I would love to talk about many of Niagara-on-the-Lake's women like Janet Carnahan, Maria Rye, Kate Crooks, Elizabeth Digweed, the Wesley Woman, and so many more, I've actually decided to talk about 5 women from Niagara-on-the-Lake's history. And I know we advertised 4, but I thought I would just add a bonus 5 just for you guys because you're so awesome. So the first woman that I do want to talk about is Mary or Molly Brant, and her Mohawk name is above there. I know a lot of the time she goes by Molly Brant, but in any letters or communication, she does sign it Mary, so I'm going to refer to her as Mary throughout the presentation. So Mary Brant is one of the most important and influential women in what we now consider to be Canadian history. During the American Revolution, the British was able to secure the loyalty of the Six Nations, largely due to the efforts and influence of Mary and her brother Joseph. While the details of her early life are scarce and assumptions have been made about it, what we do know is that Mary was born around 1736. She was a Mohawk woman, and she lived in the Mohawk Valley, which is Upper New York State. She met Sir William Johnson, who was a rich landowner, as well as the first Northern Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And in this position, Johnson was the go-between for the Crown, helping to secure alliances with the Haudenosaunee, called the Six Nations today, against the French. Mary and Johnson were married in a traditional Mohawk ceremony around the 1760s, and their marriage was not recognized under English law, which is often why you hear her being referred to as his common-law wife, his consort, or more often his housekeeper. This partnership was mutually beneficial to both parties. Mary was a Mohawk clan mother, and she had the ear of the Crown official, and it was vice versa for Johnson. So Mary was able to speak to the Six Nations issues with Johnson, and Johnson was able to speak to the Crown issues to Mary and her community. Mary started to gain influence and respect among her people and the colonizers because of this partnership. When the American Revolution began, she used this influence to persuade the Six Nations to support the British cause, as she believed that their interests would be best served by them. Mary started to get urgent messages from Colonel John Butler, who was stationed at Fort Niagara and was a longtime acquaintance of Johnson, who is now deceased. And of course, we know Colonel John Butler today as being the leader of Butler's Rangers. And some of his men came across the Niagara River over here on the western side to settle what is today Niagara-on-the-Lake. There were many people during this time, including Indigenous peoples, fleeing north to the fort in search of refuge. And the fort started to become overwhelmed. Butler knew that Mary was the only person who could help keep the peace between the Indigenous people and the British at the fort. And Mary and her family arrived at Fort Niagara in 1777, and they remained there until about 1778 or 79. She also became an important consultant during this time for the Haudenosaunee, and she often acted as an intermediary for the information going between the British and the Six Nations. And this is very similar to what Johnson was doing as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He was acting as an intermediary, but of course with the Crown's interest in mind. But instead, Mary had the interest of the Six Nations during this time. Christian Daniel Claus, who had worked alongside her husband, said of Mary, "One word from her goes further with them," in this case the Haudenosaunee, "than 1,000 from any white men without exception." And this really goes to show the respect that Mary carried amongst her community. Mary eventually made her way to Fort Haldimand, which was located on Carleton Island, as you can see here on the presentation. It was now more than ever that Mary was expected to use her influence over the Six Nations warriors. And that is because a large Six Nations force had gathered at Carleton Island, and the commander of the fort said that their uncommonly good behavior was in great measure ascribed to Miss Molly Brant's influence over them, which was far superior to that of all their chiefs put together. Again, this quote goes to show the influence that Mary had over the Six Nations and Mohawk warriors, and how respected she was, as they seemed to take her word, respect her word really over the chief's words in this case. Throughout the American Revolution, Mary continued to use her influence to ready the warriors, bolster morale, and continue to strengthen the loyalty to King George III. She eventually resettled near present-day Kingston, where the British government had granted her land. They also arranged for a house to be built and provided her with a pension in recognition for her service and dedication to the Crown. And Molly Brant died here in 1796. While she is often overlooked for her more famous brother, Joseph Brant, on the left side of the screen there, or her husband, Sir William Johnson, on the left side, her achievements should not be ignored. Mary was a very intelligent woman who was clearly at ease between these two cultures, and she was respected among the Six Nations and with the colonialist, which allowed her to use her influence on these two worlds at a vital moment in history. The next woman that I do want to talk to you today about is a woman who also used her voice to introduce influence, and her name is Chloe Cooley. In March of 1793, Chloe Cooley, who was an enslaved Black woman in Queenston, was forcibly bound, thrown in a boat, and taken across the Niagara River and sold to someone in the United States. She fiercely resisted against her owner, Adam Vrooman, who is the older gentleman in this photograph, and two other men who were required to assist him. This, however, was not the first time that Chloe fought against her enslavement. She was known to regularly behave in what was deemed an unruly manner. She stole belongings that were entrusted to her, and she refused to work and often left the estate without permission. And what happened that day to Chloe did not go unnoticed. In fact, it was witnessed by two men, Peter Martin, who was a free Black loyalist, and William Grizzly. About 1 week after this incident took place, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, the Chief Justice William Osgood, and Peter Russell at an executive council meeting heard Peter Martin and William Grizzly's eyewitness accounts. They stated that Chloe was taken against her will, violently screaming against her bondage and resisting her transfer across the river. And pictured here is the minutes taken of that meeting held on the 21st of March, 1793. And this incident motivated the Legislative Council to take immediate action to prevent other slave owners from doing the same. That day, William Grizzly further testified that other slaveholders had planned to sell their slaves in the United States, and that he saw another Black person bound in the same manner as Chloe. After learning all of this, the Executive Council wanted to take immediate steps to prevent these violent acts, and they directed the Attorney General to prosecute Vrooman for his actions. Vrooman was charged, but because he did not break the law as it presently stood, he was found not guilty. Chloe's defiance that day in March triggered legislative change. Simcoe, who himself was an abolitionist, used her incident to introduce legislation to abolish slavery in Upper Canada. And on June 19, 1793, an abolition bill was introduced, and it is said to have received much opposition but little argument from government stakeholders. The reason why there was opposition to this is because at this time, at least half of the government officials owned slaves or were members of slave-owning families. So to appease these members in the government, a compromise was reached, and what we now know as the Act to Limit Slavery in Upper Canada was passed. This act did not immediately free enslaved persons. What it was a piece of legislation that gradually abolished slavery in Upper Canada. And some pieces from this legislation was, so those who were enslaved remained so. Their children were born into slavery and remained enslaved until the age of 25, upon which they were free, and their children were free. And most importantly, and a key part of this act, is that it also prevented the importation of those enslaved in the province, and this had wide effects in the coming years. This act was the first and only piece of legislation in the British Empire to limit enslavement until 1834, when the Slavery Abolition Act came into effect. And these two pieces of legislation set the stage for the Underground Railroad into Canada. But what happened to Chloe? Unfortunately, we don't know. Once she was sold, we haven't heard from her. We have no records of her. But we do know that the legacy she left behind here in Upper Canada is that her voice of resistance changed history and the lives of those enslaved into Upper Canada and in the United States. And because of this, and because of the act and not allowing slaves to be imported into Canada, there were approximately 30,000 slaves from the United States who came to Canada through the Underground Railroad or other means for freedom. So because of her, you know, a lot of lives were changed at that period of time. The next woman that I want to talk about is not this woman here. This is a photograph of Laura Secord, and this is a woman who we often think of when we think of heroines during the War of 1812. Many of us know her story of bravery in June of 1813 when she walked through enemy-occupied territory to warn the British of an impending American attack. Instead of talking about Laura, I'm going to talk about another woman whose contribution from this period is often forgotten, and that is Mary Madden Henry. Mary was married to Dominic Henry, who at the time of the War of 1812 was a lighthouse keeper in Niagara. On May 27, 1813, the American army landed along the lakeshore near present-day Chautauqua and began their attack on Fort George. And during this bombardment, casualties were heavy, with half the British, Canadians, and Native allies killed or wounded. And during this time, Mary Henry walked the battlefield, bringing coffee and food to the troops and tended to the wounded. But Mary's selfless deeds did not end with the Battle of Fort George. On December 10th of that year, the Americans abandoned Fort George and Niagara, burning the town on their departure. The town was primarily made up of women, children, and older men, and they were given approximately 1 hour's notice before they were forced to abandon their homes and all of their belongings. Because it was an aid to the shipping for both the Americans and the British, the lighthouse and the keeper's house was spared. So Mary decided to take in some of the locals to her home and provided them with medical care, hot drinks, and food. After the War of 1812, the Loyal and Patriotic Society of Upper Canada recognized Mary's courage with a 25-pound award and described her as a heroine not to be frightened. And on this screen here is actually a poem done by her daughter, Eliza. And we have in our collection some recollections that Eliza had during this period in the War of 1812. And she actually talks about being out at, the point there and, picking up cannonballs and stuff with her siblings and some friends. So Mary and her daughter have left quite a legacy and provided us with great history for this period. Now, the next woman that I want to talk about, we often think of Janet Carnahan as being a heritage preservationist for this town, but this woman is quite unknown to many for her dedication towards preserving heritage. And that is Mary Elizabeth Olivia Josephine Servos. So you're going to hear me probably refer to her in this section of the presentation as MEOJ, or just Mary. She does have quite a long name, so I might just shorten it up a little bit for this presentation. And this is a picture of her at the age of 9 from our collection. So MEOJ was the last Servos to live in and own the 4 Mile Creek Mills or Palatine Hill property that is commonly referred to today. When her mother, Mary Servos, died, she divided the Servos farm between her 2 daughters, and Mary's inheritance comprised of 186 acres, which included the family homestead, which is pictured here, and the mills on the property. Mary was well educated, and she went to school at the Cambridge Public School, which is located at 266 King Street, so right around the corner here from the museum, and she also attended the Loretto Academy in Niagara Falls. Instead of farming the land, she hired farmers to farm it for her, which allowed her to focus her time caring for the homestead and promoting the museum that her mother had established. During the Depression era, along with many others, Mary fell into some financial hardships. She had unpaid taxes, her age was advancing, and she was unable to care for the property, and she also had the loss of a farming tenant. And this led her to approach numerous organizations to purchase the property so that it could be restored and transformed into a proper museum. But Mary added stipulations to the sale of the property. So not only did the individual or persons have to purchase the property itself, but they also had to give her room and board for life and pay her a stipend. So as you can imagine, these conditions, along with the low valued assessment on the property, drove any interested organizations away. Despite any and all efforts to preserve the homestead, including petitions to try and preserve it as a Canadian landmark and museum, at the end of the day, the provincial and federal governments did not see its preservation as a priority. Eventually, the Niagara Township forced Mary's hands, and they threatened to sell the entire property because of the years of unpaid taxes. But to Mary, that was not acceptable. So instead of losing the family home, she subdivided the property to pay the taxes still owing. And the sale of the land actually allowed her to live out the rest of her life on the homestead. And she died on June 13th, 1942, and is buried on the Servos graveyard located on the property. During her life, she took great pride in the legacy that her family had left on Niagara. She fought constantly to publicize her family's history through newspapers, radio programs, books, and magazines, and to preserve the family home and property, which had been in her family for 5 generations. As you can see here on the screen, the Evening Telegram in Toronto published an article on Palatine Hill, and then Canadian Homes and Gardens also published quite a great article on her family home in 1927. Another method that she used to preserve her family's legacy is that she took steps to maintain the property in the event of her death. And this included placing the cemetery in a trust and drafting a will with provisions to keep the property, homestead, furniture, and the Servos collection in family hands. Unfortunately, the beneficiaries of her estate were unmoved by her passion for history. And part of the family collection was sold to the Niagara Parks Commission, and through a series of transfers, the collection eventually came here to the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum. And we still care for many of these priceless relics today. And I have to say, this is probably one of the most complete and unique collections from an Upper Canadian loyalist. The collection is absolutely phenomenal, comprising of military records and various home implements as well. You know, we have a wool carder there, trunks, we have lanterns and cooking implements. It's a phenomenal collection that we're able to keep here at the museum. And it's largely because of her and her family for thinking of the preservation of it. And again, on top of everything else, the executors also sold the property, and the new owner removed any trace of the Servos mill, and the then 150-year-old homestead became abandoned. And we have a photograph here of it in around 1930 being abandoned, and you can see just the state of disrepair that it's currently in. In 1951, the owner threatened to demolish the building, but little opposition except from the Niagara Historical Society was raised by the community. And 1 year later, the building burned to the ground in a Halloween prank. And the loss of such a historic home caused no outrage by the community, and the individuals who burned the home were not prosecuted for it. So if I could, say that if we could take one lesson from Mary Elizabeth Olivia Josephine, it should be this. In a world that is developing rapidly, we need to remember that the preservation of our heritage matters. If we do not fight to preserve historic buildings and collections, then we effectively erase the stories of our past and those that have come before us. Once gone, it is almost, if not impossible, to get back. And as a museum person, I have to say, this is incredibly important. And I know a lot of people come in and say, my kids don't want anything from, our family. Consider reaching out to a local museum, and we're always happy to help you relocate any collections, or if we can take it on here at the museum with it being Niagara-on-the-Lake related. That's what we're here for. We're here to preserve our family's history and keep our legacy of our community going. And the last woman that I do want to talk to you today about, she's partially another heritage person, and she's got a soft spot in my heart. She was not only beloved locally, but she was also an outspoken advocate for the restoration of Poland. And if you already don't know her name, it's Elizabeth Asher. Elizabeth was born in Niagara-on-the-Lake in 1869 to Joseph and Margaret Masters. She was educated at both the public and high school, but it was at the high school where she may have been influenced by her teacher, Janet Carnahan, to take an interest in history and in writing. And it is no coincidence that the first Niagara Historical Society board and committee members list both Janet and Elizabeth. And following Janet Carnahan's death, she even became curator of the museum. She immersed herself in public service. She co-founded the Newark chapter of the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire and the Women's Hospital Aid, an organization that recently existed as the Niagara-on-the-Lake Hospital Auxiliary. She was also director of the Niagara Agricultural Society and the local Red Cross, and was on the board of the Boy Scouts and the Niagara High School alumni. When the first meeting for the Niagara Women's Institute was held on July 3rd, 1911, there were a total of 13 women willing to participate, but the group felt that there needed to be one more, and Elizabeth agreed, and the minutes record that there was a sigh of relief, just showing how glad they were for Elizabeth to join the Women's Institute. But her charitable work does not stop here, but I'm going to return to this in a moment. On top of all of her charitable work, she was also a reporter for the St. Catharines Standard, and also wrote for the Buffalo Times, the Old Mail and Empire, and the Niagara-on-the-Lake Advance, and her reporting career would span 37 years. When the First World War began in 1914, Elizabeth joined the Red Cross to help care for the Canadian soldiers based here at Niagara Camp, including the 35th Battalion, of which she was later named a life member. In late September of 1917, Niagara Camp was home to the Polish Army, who underwent training in Canada to fight overseas on the Western Front, and later in Poland to restore it as a country, which had not existed for over 123 years. While today Elizabeth is known for her dedication to the Polish cause, she did not immediately gravitate towards it, which I was fascinated to learn. In fact, it wasn't until July of 1918, upon the urging of the Polish community, that she realized her newspaper columns put her in a position to appeal to the public for assistance. And she immediately went to work and organized from 1918 to 1921 a large regional campaign to help the civilian population in war-torn Poland. The total number of packages or money sent to Poland is unknown, but between April 1919 and December 1920, 60 packages were sent, and Elizabeth personally paid the shipping charges on all of them. In 1918, a horrific outbreak of the Spanish influenza spread amongst the Polish soldiers in Niagara, and Asher risked her life to care for the sick soldiers, which earned her the nickname the Angel of Mercy among the troops that she cared for. And if you do want to learn more about the Spanish flu in Niagara, as well as the Polish side of the Spanish influenza, Sarah Kaufman, our managing director and curator, did do a talk earlier in our webinar series about this topic, and it can be found on our website under events and webinars. The flu claimed the lives of 20 Polish soldiers in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Asher immediately began lobbying for the creation of a Polish military cemetery at St. Vincent de Paul Church, which was granted, and the lands later became a part of sovereign Poland so that these men could be buried on home soil. She also remained the cemetery's caretaker until her death in 1941. In 1922, Asher was officially recognized for her efforts when she was granted the Polonia Restituta Medal. She is the only civilian Canadian and only Canadian woman to receive such an honor, and the accolades continue to accumulate. She was also granted the Medal of Valor, the Medal of Valor Swords, the Cross of Merit, and the Polish Medal for Long Service. She was also promoted to the Honorary Colonel of the Polish Army. She was Honorary Vice President of the Polish Army Veterans Association of America and was a life member of the Polish White Cross. Elizabeth is remembered annually on the second Sunday of June at St. Vincent de Paul Church in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And this photograph is of her grave over at St. Mark's, so they do go over to the other side and honor her on that day as well. And on this day, representatives of the Polish American communities and organizations gather at the Polish Military Cemetery to pay homage to the soldiers and to the charitable efforts of Elizabeth Asher. So these are just a few tales of the many fabulous women who have shaped Niagara-on-the-Lake's history. And since history is only as complete as the voices it includes, we have been working with members of the community to publish a book on the women of Niagara-on-the-Lake, and we'll be launching an exhibition at the museum about our community's women. And at this time, if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Shawna. Does anyone have any questions for Shawna? I could start out with one, maybe. Was there anyone that you've seen in the book that's really piqued your interest? Somebody who's like really surprised you?
Oh my gosh, I have to think of all of them. I think the best one is probably Margarita Howe. You know, in 2017, I had, like when I started here, I had no idea about her. And upon learning that about her environmental activism and her sassy attitude, you know, to get the job done and to protect the Niagara River and our environment, I think she's just a fabulous woman, and mostly because of her sassy attitude.
Yeah, so it's good to note that some of the women that are covered in the book, they're not all just historical women.
No.
Some of them are people that we've lost up until even 2020 that are being included in the book. So it'll be really neat to see that.
Yeah.
David Hemmings wants to know when the exhibit will be ready.
That's a great question. I would defer that to Sarah. We're thinking fall of this year, so we still have some research to do and, you know, narrow down the women and cut some text down. But yeah, we're hoping for fall of 2020.
Bob Knight, if you can unmute yourself, you had your hand up.
Right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Shawna.
Hi.
I just had a piece of information for you about Chloe Cooley.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I live in the village, and there is a street named after her called Cooley Lane.
Oh, excellent.
So you can add that to your notes.
Add that to my notes. Awesome. We need to have more streets named after some of our fabulous women.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
Adrian wants to know if there are other women from the War of 1812 era covered in the book.
Yes, there's Eliza Bell, who's covered in the book. She has a history to the wilderness property here in town. We're also talking about Elizabeth Campbell. There's Julia Duffield. Sarah Kirby, I think, is the other one. Yeah, so there's maybe 4 or 5 women, and of course Laura Secord is obviously covered in that section of the book as well.
Great. Yeah, so it really spans a wide range of time periods and different women. Just a few comments in the chat. Excellent presentation. And why was Mary Brant's marriage not recognized?
It wasn't recognized because under English law, you know, it wasn't the Church of England, right? So the church didn't officially recognize their marriage as being legitimate. A funny thing to note about Johnson is he never was married. He did have a previous, we'll say, wife as well. Her name was Catherine Weissenberg, and she had children with him, and they, some reason, never got married, and their children are actually considered to be the legitimate children of Johnson for some reason. So why he never got married, I don't know. Research also indicates that he was a bit of a womanizer, so I guess maybe that's part of it. I really don't know, but yeah, it just wasn't under, you know, the Church of England, and unfortunately that was the case back then.
All right, I think that is it for questions. If you have more questions, feel free to send them through to contact@nhsm.ca, and we can answer any of those questions for you. And we'll look forward for the book and the exhibition that will be coming out later this year, and the book probably in 2021, the book will come out early, or also for the exhibition time. Yeah, okay. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Our next webinar is next Thursday, July 23rd. Our Society President, David Hemmings, will be back again with another talk. This time he's presenting about British home children. And he's going to tell us all about the research that he's been doing. He's been doing a ton of research on British home children. So if you are interested in that history, or if you think that your ancestors was a British home child, it'll be very interesting for you. So thank you very much, and we'll hope to see you next week at 4 o'clock here on Zoom. Bye.